I'm going to go ahead and answer a question that was a few weeks ago when we went through Ruth. There was a question about the sleeping at the feet and the spreading of the garment. So I dug into some books. And the sleeping at the feet was an act of submission that she did to submit herself to him, but it also let him know that she was willing to become his bride. Okay, so she was saying, if you'll have me, I am here. And then when she said in the scripture to spread his cloak, that was an outward sign from him that he would wrap her in protection and keep her. Okay, and so that actually continues to this day with the wedding ceremonies in those cultures. When they get married, the last thing they do is he takes his skirts or cloak and wraps them around her, signifying that he's going to keep and protect her. So that's still something that goes on to this day, and I think it was Marcy who had asked that question, but I think she's in a different group today. But for your reading information or knowledge, there you go. And I got that from the Baker Illustrated Bible, or background commentary. It's in our library. It's really a good book. It gives a lot of the cultural and historical information for a lot of the scriptures. It's fascinating to read some of the stuff that's in here. Okay, we were going to go ahead and get going on Israel's rejection of God. Last session we saw that Samuel is called to be the prophet for Israel. And there's really some interesting things going on. There's a difference between a judge and a king. So in order to appreciate when the people were asking, when they wanted a king, it's helpful to consider the difference between a judge and a king. A judge was called by God for one main purpose: deliverance from enemies. Okay? A king in the culture back then was sovereign over all of the affairs of a tribe or a nation. A judge led by persuasion. The people followed him or disregarded him as they thought best. The book of Judges repeats the phrase, everyone did was what was right in his own eyes, several times. A king ruled by right. The people owed unconditional allegiance to a king. A judge's rule was limited to accomplish a particular purpose of deliverance. The king's rule was unlimited and included succession from generation to generation. The judges we have seen were led by God to deliver Israel in a way that would specifically show its dependence on God alone. So last week we talked about Samuel the prophet, the priest and judge of Israel. So who can remember some of the main ideas from our lesson last week with Samuel? How was he special? He proved to us that God uses people to bring about his perfect plans. Answer to Hannah's faith and the vow, God gave her a son, and Samuel served God faithfully and obediently. Through all of these events, God demonstrated many of his attributes. We saw his faithfulness in fulfilling promises, his grace in granting Hannah a son, and his justice in the judgment brought on Eli's household and a superstitious Israel. So when we left last week, where was the ark? The Philistines had the ark, okay? And, excuse me. Samuel took over as judge of Israel. This event took place at about 1117 BC. In Samuel chapter 6 and 7 is the story of the ark and how it ends up and where it goes and the consequences of them having captured it. We're not going to go there today. I'd encourage you to read that later on, but pretty much wherever the ark goes, God's not happy with it, and the cities fail, and bad things happen to them until the ark gets back to where it's supposed to be. And there's an interesting story on kind of how they just roll it down the road and let it go. Does everybody have one of these handouts? You left yours at home. Okay, but you do have one. If anybody doesn't have one, you can come up here and grab one or get one for later. It's just a good reference to see where we're at in the historical line of Israel. 20 years after Eli's death, Samuel judged Israel, and the Philistines were eventually subdued. There's a brief period of restoration as the Israelites turned back to worshiping God. But that wouldn't last long, and the Israelites were about to try to be like all the other nations around them, failing to worship God once again. This is where we're going to start out today. Samuel is getting old, and a major change is in store for the nation of Israel. If you do have your timeline, it's on here, and it's just before the United Kingdom. So we're right about here. Okay, this is the United Kingdom, and then we get more splits and separations, and craziness goes on. So if you want to join me in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And it happened when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after greedy gain, and took bribes and caused justice to turn aside. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge like all the nations." But this thing was evil in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to Yahweh. Then Yahweh said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. So now listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly testify to them and tell them of the custom of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel spoke all the words of Yahweh to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, "This will be the custom of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and fifties, and some to do his plowing, and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for performers, and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male slaves and your female slaves and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. But Yahweh will not answer you in that day." Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, and that we may also be like all the other nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." So Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of Yahweh. Then Yahweh said to Samuel, "Listen to their voices and appoint them a king." So Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city." So, where did Samuel's sons do? Did they do what their father had done? No. They decided they were just going to get greedy, make money off the whole situation. They took bribes. They perverted justice. So what did the elders in turn do? They said, okay, your sons can't be judges, and we're just tired of this. What do we want? We want a king. They felt that the king was going to judge them like all the other nations, and Samuel wasn't happy with that. He was very displeased. So how did God respond? Did God get... He said, let them have a king. Yeah, they want a king, so be it. So when Israel says they want a king, who are they rejecting? God. Okay. So they wanted a king who was going to go before them and fight all of their battles and carry them into victory and judge them. What had God already been doing? Just exactly that. He had fought all of their battles. He had taken out of Israel. He defeated Egypt quite handily. And all of these things, he provided for them, judged them, but they wanted a physical representation in the flesh, standing in front of them. This is our king, when they had the greatest king in the universe already. So, what warning did God give the people through Samuel? What did he tell them was going to happen if they got a king? Yeah, he's going to take their sons, best sons, best daughters, best crop, best everything, their money, and he was just going to use it for his own gain. So in verses 19 and 20, what do people say? We don't care. Yep, we don't care. It is what it is. Send us a king. So God's final word in the matter, so be it. Let them have a king, Samuel. So God's been leading the Israelites, providing for their every need, fighting every battle for them. They could have not asked for a better king than God himself. And in this act, Israel rejects God's wisdom and ignores his warning. They doubted God's faithfulness to keep his promises. I can't find one failed promise from God. And I look back, I mean, we have the graciousness of being able to look back on all of this. Israel was stubborn. But I think even worse, they were impatient. Because they wanted their king. They wanted their king now. They wanted him to do exactly what they wanted, and they wanted everything right now. They didn't want to wait on the promises of God. Right. They wanted to be like everybody else. And it's like they had blinders on their eyes or a fog over their eyes that they just couldn't see how bad everybody else was. But like you said, Marie, they just wanted to be like everybody else. So they doubted God's love for them as a people. And I can't see how they could ever doubt that. I mean, they were spoiled. Yep, that's a good point. I never thought of them being spoiled. They've had everything. They fed them for 40 years in the desert, and they still got upset. And, we're tired of eating the same thing every day. My goodness. Oh, yes. Wouldn't that be something? They had rejected God's grace, the grace of God, and he had shown them over the past 400 years since they had been led out of Egypt. And they did all this so that they would be, like you said, Marie, just like the world. God gave them what they wanted, even though they knew the trouble that it would bring. If they really thought a human king would be better than the heavenly king, they were wrong. So King Saul is going to be the first king of Israel. And as we continue, I'm going to give you a summary of kind of what happened in chapters 9 and 10 for the first parts. Kish is the father of Saul, and he lost some donkeys. And Saul and a servant went looking for the donkeys. And after the donkeys had been lost for 3 days, they sought the counsel of Samuel the prophet. And Samuel was in town for a sacrifice, and they met him on the road. And by God's revelation, Samuel knew they were coming and told them about the donkeys. And they were already safe back at home. So Samuel brought Saul to the feast and honored him there. And the next morning, Samuel anointed Saul and sent him home, giving a detailed prophetic description of what he would encounter on his journey. 1 Samuel 10:9 says that God changed Saul's heart, and he saw all of Samuel's prophecy come true as he returned home. So Saul also prophesied among a group of prophets under the power of the Spirit of God. So God changed his heart. He gave him these things. He had him to where he could prophesy and really had an impact on him. All right, we're going to read 1 Samuel 10:17 through 27. Then Samuel called the people together to Yahweh at Mizpah, and he said to the sons of Israel, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But you have today rejected your God, who saves you from all of your calamities and your distresses. Yet you have said, 'No, but set a king over us.' So now take your stand before Yahweh by your tribes and by your clans." Thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the Matrite family was taken. And Saul, the son of Kish, was taken, but they looked for him, and he could not be found. Therefore they inquired further of Yahweh, "Has the man come here yet?" So Yahweh said, "Behold, he is hiding himself by the baggage." So they ran and took him from there, and he stood among the people, and he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. Pretty much he was actually a head taller than everybody else, so he'd have been 6 foot probably back then. Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom Yahweh has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people." So all the people shouted and sang, "Long live the king." Then Samuel spoke with the people about legal judgments of the kingdom, and he wrote them in a book and placed it before Yahweh. And Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his house. Saul also went to the house at Gibeah, and the valiant men whose hearts God had touched went with him. But certain vile men said, "How can this one save us?" And they despised him and did not bring him any present, but he kept silent. So, how did Samuel choose the king from among the tribes? I thought this was strange. We talked about it earlier, but he chose them by lots. So that was today it would be like rolling dice. But they used sticks, and like, drawing the short stick, and God would influence those. So it was God's choice. The house of Benjamin. So they picked Saul, and he didn't actually want to be the king. He turned tail and went and was hiding by the baggage. So that's kind of funny to me. So how's Saul described in verse 23? It said, they ran and took him there, and he stood among the people, and he was taller than any of the people, head and shoulders upward. So basically a head taller. So did Samuel choose Saul, or did God choose Saul? I think, God chose Saul to be the prophet. So the people are happy. They've got themselves a tall, handsome king. And how do they respond? Long live the king. Huzzah! Long live the king. So after this, Samuel puts all the information in a book. He records it and tells them the expected behavior of the king. So what roles did Samuel fulfill? He did as God told him. He anointed the king, offered sacrifices, spoke for God, and told of future events. And that's all in the very first part of Samuel chapter 10. So it's, he anointed him and did all of these things that God had asked him to do. So now as the people requested, they now had a king, just like other nations around them. They had rejected God as their king, but God granted their request. Although they would serve the coming kings under much oppression, they wanted to be just like the rest of the world. So as we go through the rest of the history of Israel, we're going to see these problems play out. God knew what he was doing. So why do you think God let Israel have a king? Yeah, I mean, they were already rebellious, stiff-necked, impatient. But I want you to think a little bit further down the line about why would God allow a king? If he had been rejected as king, why would he allow them to have a king? Talking about the overall plan here. Okay, down the line, it brings David to the throne. And where does the once and future king who reigns now, where does he come from? David's line. So this was the plan to begin with. God knew that they were going to reject him. But he's like, okay, go ahead, reject me. I got this. I got this all figured out. David's going to come along. My son Jesus is going to come through that line. He's going to be the king. And guess what? I'm still the king. So he had it all worked out. So Jesus was to come king of the Jews and the king of kings through the line of the king of David. God allowed the earthly kingdom to be established in preparation for the coming of heavenly King Jesus. So is Saul in the line of Messiah? No, he's in the house of Benjamin. Okay? Since Saul was in the tribe of Benjamin and the Messiah was to come through Judah, there has to be another king to come. This should remind us of how wise and omnipotent God is to allow a sinful request of rejecting God as king to bring about his perfect plan. God often uses bad things to bring about good, and that is exactly what we see in this account. So God's going to reject Saul. You can read about Saul's actions in chapters 11 and 12 on your own, but chapter 13 is where he calls Israel to battle at Gilgal against the Philistines. And Samuel has instructed him to wait 7 days, at which time Samuel would come and offer sacrifices. We do not have an exact command recorded in the text, though some would connect it back to chapter 10, verse 8. And some of the time markers in chapter 13 seem to preclude this. So we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8 through 15. Okay. So he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring near to me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "Because I saw the people were scattering from me, that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal. I have not entreated the favor of Yahweh, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him at about 600 men. So Samuel didn't show up, and Saul took it on himself out of his own impatience to offer the burnt offering to the Lord. Samuel's response to Saul, as he greeted him, he asked Saul what he had done, and he's trying to justify his actions. He says, "Well, you were late, and I was compelled to do this on my own. I just took it on myself and was afraid of the attack, and I just wanted to do it." So how did Samuel respond to that? Called him a fool. "You have acted foolishly and have violated the command of God." I don't know any one of these leaders that did anything 100% by the command of God. And it seems like every time they do something, it's a little bit worse, a little bit worse. So the consequences of Saul's behavior, consequences of his disobedience, his kingdom would not continue and another king would be established. So what king is God seeking? One after his own heart. We know who that is. That's David. Okay? And so we can kind of take a look back and see how this plan has been evolving, because back in Ruth, now we have Jesse, and this whole situation is all coming to fulfill the line of David. It's just so inspiring to look back and see all the little pieces that keep falling into place. You read ahead, you look back, and he's like, he was here, he was here, he was here, and all of these little steps just lead all the way up. It's amazing. So was Saul acting by faith or by sight when he offered his sacrifices? By sight, okay? He saw, so he was focusing on his circumstances rather than exercising faith in God. Okay, as the prophet and priest of God, Samuel had instructed Saul as to how God would have him act. And Saul had a choice. He could wait for Samuel to come and offer the sacrifices, or Saul could do things in his own way, in his own timing. And we can see where that got him. We're gonna skip over chapters 13 and 14. There's a bunch more battles, and these are good things for you to go back and take a gander at. I enjoy them because they're battles, and seeing how God works through these things. They're not as gory as watching a Netflix show or anything, but they do get a little explicit. So 1 Samuel 15, Saul's disobedience. Now Samuel said to Saul, "Yahweh sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. So now obey the voice of the words of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he let himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, infant and nursing baby, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Then Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the valley. And Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, depart. Go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. You showed loving kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. So Saul struck the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he seized Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good. And they were not willing to devote them to destruction, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly back up here. And they were not willing to devote them to destruction, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed. Then the word of Yahweh came to Samuel, saying, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not established my words." And Samuel became angry and cried out to Yahweh all night. Then Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul. And it was told to Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, then turned and proceeded on down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of Yahweh. I have established the word of Yahweh." But Samuel said, "What then is the sound of the sheep in my ears and the sound of the oxen which I am hearing?" And Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to Yahweh your God, but the rest we have devoted to destruction." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Wait, and let me tell you what Yahweh spoke to me last night." And he said to him, "Speak." And Samuel said, "Is it not true that you were little in your own eyes? You were made the head of the tribes of Israel, and Yahweh anointed you king over Israel. And Yahweh sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of Yahweh?" He rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Then Saul said to Samuel, "I did obey the voice of Yahweh and went on the way on which Yahweh sent me, and I have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest and the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to Yahweh your God at Gilgal." And Samuel said, "Has Yahweh as much delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is in the sin of divination, and the insubordination is a wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I have indeed trespassed against the command of Yahweh and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. So now please forgive my sin and return with me that I may worship Yahweh." But Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king over Israel." Then Samuel turned to go, but Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, "Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Also, the Eternal One of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret." Then he said, "I have sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of the people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship Yahweh your God." So Samuel returned following after Saul, and Saul worshiped Yahweh. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag near to me, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him in chains, and Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death has departed." But Samuel said, "As your word has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before Yahweh at Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, but Saul went up to the house at Gibeah of Saul. So we had a little violence there. What did God command Saul to do? Kill everybody. And I know we've been over this a few times, and we're probably going to see it again, but he's asking for the total destruction of these people because they are so evil that they start these traditions from the time that they're little kids where they're worshiping idols and witchcraft and all of these things that they do, and it's bred into them. So if one was to survive, it would just taint Israel. They would take these practices in. They would just, it's kind of like yeast. They would, the leavening of yeast in the bread, one little bit of yeast in the dough makes it rise, and then it just creates all of this horrible thing. And God knows this. So he wanted everything wiped out. He wanted them to trust him. And again, Saul didn't do it. So he kept the king alive, the best of the flocks, bringing him back to Gilgal, thinking he was going to be slick. He was going to be the big hero and make a big presentation in front of all the people. Look at me, I'm your king. I captured this king, and I've got all of this stuff so we can have sacrifices and feasts. Not what God wanted. It's not about Saul. It's about God. So Samuel found out because God told him. So what's the first thing that Saul does when he's confronted? Telling Samuel the story. What does he tell him? A bunch of hogwash. He's telling him lies. Justifying his behavior, telling him lies. Kind of like what John said, this morning in the sermon. We all have to fight against lying, and it's like first nature rather than second nature to tell a lie. So he's trying to cover himself, and he's just going to lie to do it. Right, yeah, and he was blaming, yeah, yep, which is misrepresentation, a lie as well. So he tells Samuel that I did fulfill the command. I did what I was told, which he had not. So, yeah, when Samuel asks him, okay, so what is this sheep I hear and these cows I hear? He shifts the blame to the people for bringing back the animals for sacrifice. He does it again in a later verse. So what do we learn about God's view of obedience? How does God view, he gave him a command. Better than sacrifice. So Saul was like, well, I'm going to collect all of these sheep and oxes and all of this stuff, and then I'll sacrifice and I'll make God happy, even though I disobeyed him, but the sacrifices will appease him. He wants obedience first. And that was a little bit hard for Saul to get through his head, I think, because Saul was not serving God, Saul was serving himself. So the consequences for Saul, he's rejected from God from being king, and the kingdom was to be removed from him, as he had already been told in chapter 13. So, and this is an example of the Old Testament where a prophet announces judgment on an individual. So the prophet Samuel announced judgment. And how did Samuel complete the task Saul was sent to accomplish? He took it to Agag and hacked him into pieces. And that was a direct quote. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, angry at Saul, probably, I would assume that he had some frustration in himself. I know how that goes sometimes. Oh, and you lash out. And I think this would be an example of righteous anger. And I don't know the height or stature of these people, but I know the implements that they used back in the day were extremely heavy. So I'm figuring the sword probably weighed 50 pounds. So for a man in his 80s to wield this 50-pound sword in that kind of anger and do what he said he did is quite a feat. Yeah, exactly, an act of God. In the early, yeah, and if you notice through the timeline, it gets shorter. So I believe after the Exodus and everything like that, we were in 120s and then 110s and then 80s and 90s, and we're in that range now. So I want to jump over to John chapter 14. Real quick, one verse. Verse 15. And real simple to memorize. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And obeying the Lord is a sign of our love for him. And Saul demonstrated that he was not willing to obey God's commands, and therefore he did not love God. And I think that's the long and the short of the stories that we read today, is that Saul was self-serving, he didn't love God, and all of Israel had to pay for it. In your handouts you got today is a little homework assignment. It's called Getting to the Root. In Scripture, we can see that the fruit of our lives and the root that supplies the growth of that fruit, fruit from a bad tree will be bad, and the fruit from a good tree will be good. And plucking off the bad fruit will not make good fruit grow if the tree is bad at its roots. Saul had some rotten fruit. Disobedience, rebellion, arrogance, and you may have some rotten fruit in your life as well. So in order to correct the bad fruit that is presenting itself as sin in our lives, we need to understand what underlying causes are the root. So during the week, I'd like you to go through this and just take a look. We're going to diagnose sin's soulful actions and try to get to the root of his problem. Excuse me. So you're going to go through those scriptures and then kind of do a self-exploration as well and see where is our root? What are some of our flaws? Where do we need to correct ourselves? So, what connections can you make among these sinful manifestations? What might be the cause of Saul's disobedience? And then if you were to counsel a friend, consider sin that presents itself regularly in your life. Lying, anger, slander, laziness, covetousness, lust, etc. And how can we get at the root of this? How can we flush that out of our lives? I think that will be very beneficial. Does anybody have any questions or anything about what we talked about today? Any comments? Okay, let's close in prayer real quick, and then we will go about our days. Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us your word. We thank you that we have it all, that we can look at your word as it is in its entirety and look back at how things have played out and how you work and how you continue to work today. Thank you for everyone here this morning and their attention and their willingness to learn. Let your word seep into our hearts, Father. Ask you to be with everybody today. Give us safe travels and continue our day. We love you and ask it all in Jesus' name.